Hello, everyone. I want to take a second look at these excerpts from what is the last part. I think it's the very ending of Darwin's The Descent of Man. This was published in 1871, 12 years after Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859. The Origin of Species was a general theory, or the book presented a general theory of nature that promoted the idea that species change over time, long periods of time, which was an idea that was in the air long before Darwin. And Darwin's own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a biologist who, I think about 60 years before Darwin, was one of the people who proposed the idea that species do change, and that is the idea that species are not fixed. That is, that any species is the result of changes from previous species, if that idea makes sense, the way that I put it. So that was one of the ideas. The other idea was not just that species change over time, change their form over time, evolve into new species, but the mechanism by which they do it, and that was natural selection. And that was a truly original idea that Darwin came up with. That is, there were biologists who believed that species change over time, but no one had really given a coherent explanation of how that happened. And natural selection, which we associate with the idea of survival of the fittest and adaptation, still is the basic explanation of the mechanism through which species change. That is, if a variation is introduced into a population, a chance variation, something that we would associate with a genetic mutation, and if it gives the carriers of that mutation an advantage over their fellow species members in the struggle for existence, then that mutation will spread throughout the population, and the population will change in a small way. It's the accumulation of those small changes over long periods of time that constitutes evolution, because one little change spreading throughout a population does not constitute a species change. But if you think about those being accumulated, we can see how a population of a species at one time could be very different, so different from previous forms of that species, that would constitute a species change. So that's a general idea, as I take it, of evolution by way of natural selection, and that was the theory that was put forward in The Origin of Species. But very little was said, and it was only hinted at in The Origin of Species about whether and how this would apply to human beings. And from the title of the book, The Descent of Man, man standing in for mankind or human beings in general, to say they had a descent, that is to claim that they themselves, that is our species, evolved from earlier species, which is a very huge change, and just a tremendous change in the way that human beings think of themselves, of their origins. Most of the common beliefs, such as they were about human origins before Darwin, were religious or mythical, or just not thought of. The notion was, at least in Christian countries, and I suppose any country that adopted, or thought that the book of Genesis was a historical fact, human beings just thought of themselves as being created there, created as described there, that is created by God. So any suggestion that human beings have a descent is quite a large change in the way we think of ourselves. Okay, so if we begin to actually look at the text, as I said in the brief video that I sent out, or that I posted last week, There's not one argument here. It's clear that the first paragraph, which is from a slightly different part of the text, is separate from the rest, and that there are actually, I think, three arguments here, because there's three propositions or three hypotheses or three conclusions, however you want to put it. But if we look at the first paragraph, Darwin makes it pretty clear what the proposal is, that is, what he wants to put over. And I think it's put in two ways. He does say in the first paragraph that the main conclusion here arrived at gives us a pretty big hint about what the main conclusion is, and now held by many naturalists who are well competent to form a sound judgment, is that man, and of course he means by man the usual thing that was meant by that kind of man with a capital M, human beings, that man is descended from some less highly organized form. The less highly organized might cloud the thing a little bit. I think the big message being that human beings are descended. They are the descendants of other beings, of another form of life, a non-human form of life. And then he gives certain reasons for it: embryonic development, geographical distribution, etc. But then at the end of the paragraph, he kind of restates what the main conclusion is by saying that no one can any longer believe that man is the work of a separate act of creation. So you can put it either way. Either his main point here in this first paragraph is that we human beings are descended from some less highly organized form. And by less highly organized, you could imagine fish or single-cell creatures, which if you go back far enough, we certainly are descended from. I wouldn't say that the previous forms of hominids that we're descended from are less highly organized, but if you go back far enough, everything is descended from a less highly organized form. But that's the one way of putting it, and the other way of putting it is that we human beings are not the result of a separate act of creation, a la the account in Genesis, where God creates all the other forms of life and then separately creates human beings. That's the idea of human origins that, frankly, Darwin is trying to demolish here by just sheer weight of argument and fact. So that's the first one. You can say, and I put it there not to confuse the issue, but I thought that the two arguments that follow, or the two issues that follow, about trying to account for human intelligence and trying to account for the human disposition towards morality, that those questions only really emerge once the more general thesis is put over, that is, that human beings have evolved, that everything about them, you might say, is a product of evolution, and evolution by way of natural selection. So I think it was important to put that first part up there before we look at the more specific questions about not the origin of humans in general, but the origins of the most definitive human attributes, reason and morality. So if we look to the rest of the excerpt, it's quite clear that he has two main questions and two main things that he wants to establish. I mean, insofar as this is a kind of a summary at the end of the book of things that he explored in much more detail, but something that is more compact and leave an impression. So this is not his total argument. I mean, if you read Darwin, his idea of a total argument is hundreds of pages of facts and smaller things trying to really rigorously establish something, which was a very radical thesis in his time. But these are the summaries and more comprehensible, smaller versions of it. But it's clear that he has two things that he wants to establish, and they're both, or they're stated in the beginning of the paragraph here: the high standard of our intellectual powers and moral disposition is the greatest difficulty which presents itself after we have been driven to this conclusion on the origin of man. That is, once we accept the general thesis that human beings evolved from other less highly organized forms, that they are subject to evolution just as much as any other animal, and that everything about them, that is, all of the features that human beings have, need to be accounted for, according to Darwin, in terms of their evolutionary history. The two big problems, he says, is, well, how do we get so smart? That is, human reason. And how do we develop moral behaviors, moral nature? Because the idea is that at one point, you have to think that at one point in biological history, the general biological history of the Earth, there were no creatures that had the kind of intellect that we do, especially reason, the capacity to form inferences, use our imagination to create technologies, things like that. That at one point, there were no such creatures. And at one point, when it comes to morality, the notion of a creature, an animal that has a moral sense, a sense of right and wrong, a notion that their conduct is subject to some kind of moral law rather than just instinctual. That at one point, those things existed in no creatures that existed on the earth, and then they did. So the idea is they must have evolved naturally. That is, if you look at the Genesis account, God creates human beings in his image, and that is, for instance, why the great Catholic theologian Thomas Aquinas interpreted it as God gave human beings not his physical shape, which makes no sense, but rather God imparted to as a gift to human beings intellect and will, which means the capacity to think and the capacity to make free choices, to be a moral creature, that these were simply gifts from God in the old way of thinking of it, at least in Western Christian thinking. But under Darwin, those kind of explanations have no place. This is not a work of theology, it's a work of science. So the idea is that we have to come up with some sort of explanation within nature, within natural development, to account for those two things. Why are we so smart? Why can we think? Why can we reason? And why do we have a moral nature? And he treats them, separately. He goes after the first question first, the first question about how do we get so smart, and says, but everyone who admits the principle of evolution must see that the mental powers of the higher animals, which are the same in kind with those of man, though so different in degree, are capable of advancement. So the first thing that so you could say another premise to, or the first premise to his argument, is that human intelligence does not differ in kind from animal intelligence, it just differs in extent. That is, we are much smarter than any other creature, but that does not mean that our intelligence is of an entirely different kind, it's just more extensive. And then he says, a little bit farther on, let me make this a little bigger. He says, for with our domesticated animals, the mental faculties are certainly variable, and the variations are inherited. No one doubts that they are of the utmost importance to animals in the state of nature. Therefore, the conditions are favorable to their development through natural selection, which is basically to say that intelligence is a favorable trait. So it's one of those variations. If an animal in a population inherits, just say through genetic mutation, a slightly higher intelligence, then they may have an advantage over their competitors in the struggle for existence. So that intelligence is one of those traits, like strength or speed or size, depending upon the environment, which are favored and or will tend to increase in the population. So the question of why are we so smart is really not that difficult for Darwin. The presumption is that we are so smart because intelligence is heritable and high intelligence is an adaptation. So it's going to naturally or it did naturally, one would suppose, act in the development, the evolution of the human species as an adaptable trait that was heritable. And so we don't have the details here, but language, he says, was part of it. That human reason or human intelligence was simply something that developed naturally, just as it does in other animals. It just developed to a higher degree. At some point, intelligence became our defining adaptation, our most advantageous adaptation, you might say. And so, the argument there is simply that we got smarter because getting smarter was an adaptation, one would presume, in the history of our species. He doesn't see it as a huge problem. The big problem he sees, the bigger problem, is how could morality have emerged? And that's what he deals with next. The development of the moral qualities is a more interesting problem and a more difficult problem. Right? But what does he say? He says the foundation lies in the social instincts. And that's the first thing. The first assumption is that in our evolutionary past, before we became truly human, we were already social creatures. We had social instincts, like a lot of other creatures. That is, we had instincts that impelled us to do things for our fellow species members. As he said, warn one another of danger, defend and aid one another in many ways. So that's not too difficult, right? Let's just posit that human beings at an earlier stage of evolutionary development already had social instincts. But remember, we already became, at some point, we became a heck of a lot smarter than the other creatures, and a lot of this was resulted in memory and imagination. So he says then, a moral being is one who is capable of reflecting on his past actions and their motives, of approving of some and disapproving of others. And the fact that man is the one being who certainly deserves this designation is the greatest of all distinctions between him and the lower animals. Well, let's just go a little bit further here. He says, owing to this condition of mind, man cannot avoid looking both backwards and forwards and comparing past impressions. Hence, after some temporary desire or passion has mastered his social instinct. That is, human beings have social instincts, but they also act selfishly. And they also have the capacity to remember these things because they're so smart. Hence, after some temporary desire or passion has mastered his social instincts, he reflects and compares the now weakened impression of such past impulses with the ever-present social instincts. He then feels that sense of dissatisfaction, which all unsatisfied instincts leave behind them. He therefore resolves to act differently for the future, and this is conscience. That is, we are social creatures who sometimes act selfishly. Let's just say we act selfishly and we do not do something that our social instincts would tell us to do. Okay. Then, because we're so smart, we remember it. We think about these things. We remember these things. We work them over in our minds. And when we do, the selfish instinct is in abeyance. It's weakened. But our social instincts are still there. And what we feel is an unsatisfied, in memory, an unsatisfied desire to satisfy those social instincts. And we feel bad. It's guilt. It's conscience. So that, I think, is the most important thing that he said, is basically said that if you take a creature with social instincts and also a high degree of intelligence so that they can remember past experiences and mull them over, it's almost inevitable that you'll get something like a moral creature and his origins of conscience here. Now, the rest of it, is a cultural argument. That is what he goes on. When he says here that human beings, differ differs also from the lower animals in the power of expressing his desires by words. He's getting into human culture, and he's getting into the praise and blame, and how they affect us and they affect our behavior. And yeah, so that he recognizes that culture, language, and culture also encourage us to be moral, but that's another side of it. And finally, he says the moral nature of man has reached the present standard partly through the advancement of his reasoning powers and consequently of a just public opinion, but especially from his sympathies having been rendered more tender and widely diffused through the effects of habit, example, instruction, and reflection. So I think what he said here is that there is a basic argument that any creature that has social instincts and also a high degree of intelligence will inevitably become something like a moral creature. And then with the development of culture, language, custom, habits, education, that will tend to more and more encourage that moral nature. But the big argument is one that's put up here, I think, that if you combine social instincts with high intelligence, something like a moral creature will emerge.